Hello, and welcome to this event to launch the report from the Geospatial Commission, Lovelace Institute in Traverse. I should just start by introducing myself. I'm David Leslie. I'm the Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute. And let me also say a few words on how timely and important this public dialogue on data location ethics that has been set in motion by the Geospatial Commission is. So it may well be said that artificial intelligence and data-driven systems are increasingly becoming general purpose technologies. They are penetrating into virtually every area of human experience and across all sectors of society. The innovation spawning character of AI means that it is likely to have protracted aggregate impacts and knock-on effects in all innovation domains. And as more and more data are collected in an integrated and networked digital world of connected devices that contain countless sensors and sites of geospatial measurement, there will likely be exponential gains in the power of AI to improve the provision of essential social goods and services, but also to potentially affect broad-scale harms. This is why we need, in fact, to think about AI as more than just a general-purpose technology, like electricity or steam power. AI is a gatekeeper technology whose producers and users uniquely hold the key both to possibilities for the exponential advancement of well-being, but also to the potential for the human production of significant risks. In our context, uses of high-quality location data open up prospects for great public benefit. As the geospatial strategy highlighted, and I would recommend reading it, unlocking the power of location data can lead to step change improvements in infrastructure, transportation, housing and local planning, environmental sustainability, energy conservation, public health management, and emergency responses, among many other areas. But at the same time, the irresponsible development and misuse of location data also raises potential societal hazards. Normalization of location tracking can lead to surveillance creep, and misuses of personally identifiable location data can enable the building of social graphs that expose intimate details of private lives and personal relationships. When misused or abused, pervasive location tracking can have a chilling effect on freedoms of assembly, movement, and expression, and thus potentially on democratic forms of life more generally. Intrusive personal targeting can undermine people's sense of privacy, autonomy, and agency, and data-driven curation can impede identity formation and leave some people feeling disempowered. So these risks show us why justified public trust in the responsible collection and use of location data is so important. And this is what makes the Geospatial Commission's initiation of this public dialogue on location data ethics so crucial. We are honored and grateful at the Alan Turing Institute to have the opportunity to host this event. So let me just kick it off by giving you an idea of our agenda, the event's agenda, and then going over some housekeeping items. So first of all, we're going to start with introductions to the Geospatial Commission and its policy work on ethics. Then our colleagues from Traverse and Ada Lovelace will present an overview on the public dialogue and engagement report. We'll then have a keynote from our very own co-director of the public policy program, Cosmina Dorobantu. Finally, we'll get together a panel session with colleagues from the Geospatial Commission, Information Commissioner's Office, the Open Data Institute, and Global Broadcast Media. And finally, we'll break out into an optional group of networking sessions that will be broken down into the categories of the findings. A few housekeeping items. Today's event has closed captions. Please link on the tab called Captions and click Show Captions if you'd like this service. If you want to submit a question for the panelists, you can submit questions via the Slido Q&A tab. We encourage you to upvote other audience questions that are similar to your own to ensure that all important questions are covered. We'll try our best to answer as many of the questions possible, though the panel's only 30 minutes. We will be recording this event, and it will be hosted on YouTube after this live stream. So if you need to log off early for any reason, you'll be able to catch up later. There will also be, as I mentioned, an optional networking session at 4 o'clock. And please, we would love for you to join us in any one of the rooms that you'll see on the hop-in. And finally, the chat will be open to all viewers and participants. But please be reminded of our events code of conduct and keep all messages friendly and professional. A link that is going in the chat right now will provide further information. So without further ado, let me introduce our first presenter. This is Callum Adams. He is Location Data Ethics Lead at the Geospatial Commission. He joined the Commission in April of 2021 to lead its ethics work, including overseeing the public dialogue from the Geospatial Commission side. So I will turn it over to Callum. Go right ahead.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Callum. I'm the Location Data Ethics Lead at the Commission. It's really nice to meet you all, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Independent Public Dialogue Report. Before I hand over to Traverse and the Ada Lovelace Institute to introduce the report and talk through its findings, I want to talk about the Commission's work on location data ethics and why we commissioned the public dialogue. The Geospatial Commission was established in 2018 as an independent expert committee within the Cabinet Office. It's responsible for setting the UK's geospatial strategy, coordinating public sector geospatial activity and making targeted interventions. Last year, we published the UK's geospatial strategy. Within that are 4 missions, one of which is to promote and safeguard the use of location data. It includes a commitment to provide guidance on how to unlock value from sensitive location data while mitigating security, ethical, and privacy risks. So, why is ethics important? Location data underpins our modern digital society. It powers our everyday lives and drives innovation and better services. It helps us find the fastest and in the future greenest route. It allows us to check the weather where we are. It provides us with the most relevant online search results. It pinpoints us on a map and helps us find our destination. And it allows us to track the taxi we've ordered to get us there. The UK's geospatial strategy sets an ambitious vision to unlock the power of location data and recognises that society can only continue to benefit from the widespread use of location data and its future opportunities if location data is used in a way that retains and builds public confidence. The Commission has committed to providing guidance about how to unlock locations data's immense value while mitigating ethical considerations and retaining public confidence. To inform this guidance, we embarked on a programme of work, starting with an independent public dialogue, which is one of the UK's first deliberative consultations on location data. Now, the first step in writing any guidance is to understand what the relevant issues and considerations are. Up to now, there's been a significant gap in research around public attitudes about location data, and building this understanding is important to build ethical and trustworthy use. In March, the Commission and UKRI Sciencewise programme commissioned Traverse and the Ada Lovelace Institute to deliver an independent public dialogue on the ethics of location data use. The dialogue's been supported by an independent and diverse expert oversight group that we formed to guide the process. Its members are location data experts from the private sector, academia and government, and they include David Leslie from Turing, as well as Mick Ridley and Matthew Rice, who are both sitting on our panel today. Thank you both. The findings of our dialogue are captured in the report, which was published earlier this morning. Before I hand over to Traverse and Ada, I thought it might be helpful to outline how we've got to this point. So in June 2020, the government published the UK's geospatial strategy, an ambitious 5-year strategy to unlock the power of location data. It contained a commitment to produce guidance on the ethical use of location data. In March, we launched the public dialogue to explore public perceptions about location data by engaging with a broadly representative sample of the UK public. The 4 virtual workshops took place between June and September. In November, we sought to build on our public engagement and test the findings of the dialogue by running a quantitative survey against a nationally representative sample. The findings from this survey will be published at the start of next year. Today, we're publishing the public dialogue report. This sets us up well to move to the next stage of our policy development, engaging further with organisations to understand more about their perceptions of ethics. We'll then put guidance out by the summer. We're grateful to all those who contribute to this project, including UKRI Sciencewise programme, which provided funding and expertise, Traverse and the Ada Lovelace Institute, who designed and delivered the public dialogue, the members of our independent oversight group, in particular John Pullinger as chair, who ensured the expertise and independence of the project, and the members of the public who so wholeheartedly participated and contributed to the debate. Thank you all. I'll hand back to David.
Great. Thank you so much, Callum. That was really informative and excellent. So now we're going to move on to a presentation by Traverse and Ada Lovelace. From Ada Lovelace, we have, hey, Aidan Sky, Aidan Pepin. He's a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and he leads public attitudes and engagement projects from national polls on the ethics of facial recognition to citizens' juries. Citizens' juries and the governance of health data. Previously, Aidan worked at Wellcome on the ethics of AI and data in health, including working on understanding patient data and data for science and health priority area. And his research background is in the humanities and the social sciences, with a focus on applying qualitative, quantitative, and deliberative methods to understand relationships between technology, culture, and society. Skye McCool is a senior consultant at Traverse. Her background is in science and environmental education, which is informed by a lifetime of experience in visual design and communications. She's a trained graphic facilitator and designs, manages, and delivers public and stakeholder engagement with a commitment to accessibility and inclusivity. Please take it away, Skye and Aidan.
Thanks, David. Afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As David mentioned, I'm Skye from Traverse, and we're a social purpose consultancy that supports better decision-making through the power of inclusion.
And I'm Aidan, Senior Researcher for Public Engagement at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We're an independent research institute based in the UK, and our mission is to ensure data and artificial intelligence work for people and society.
In March 2021, the Geospatial Commission and UKRI's Sciencewise program commissioned us to deliver a public dialogue on the ethics of location data use. The dialogue aimed to engage a diverse cross-section of the public to understand their attitudes towards location data and their views on the trustworthy and ethical use of it. We designed a deliberative process known as a dialogue. This is a qualitative process which is long form and reflective. It's usually held over a number of hours and sessions as opposed to top of mind one-off research like a focus group. It takes participants on a learning journey where they hear different information and are supported to hear from and question specialists. It involves a diverse range of people, and it embraces complexity while exploring consensus, looking for why people think things, not just what they think, and exploring commonalities and disagreement.
So to inform the design of the public dialogue that we ran, colleagues and I at the Ada Lovelace Institute worked with the team at Traverse to conduct some background research on existing surveys, polls, public dialogues, qualitative research, and more, looking at public attitudes towards data and data use. And we found, as Callum already mentioned, that there is very limited research on public attitudes towards location data specifically. However, there is a very broad body of research on public attitudes towards data more generally, and we drew some insights from this to help us design the dialogue. Some of these insights include the fact that many surveys and studies show that people do recognize that data offers significant opportunities both to themselves as individuals and to wider society, but they also recognize the ethical considerations that it raises around privacy, around the power of digital technologies, and so on. And the challenge many people feel is balancing both the benefits and the ethical considerations. A lot of research also shows that many people are comfortable sharing data and sharing personal data of their own when it's for public benefit. But they do consider that fairness and responsible use of data are really, really important to feeling comfortable with sharing data, even when they recognize there is a public benefit to sharing that data. There are a number of polls which demonstrate that public trust in public sector, government and non-profit use of data is relatively high. Bodies like the NHS and local councils are quite trusted when it comes to data use. This is compared to very low levels of trust in private sector and commercial uses of data, social media companies, your tech giants, and so on. And the Royal Statistical Society, in some research they conducted a few years ago, described this as a data trust deficit. And a lot of research, particularly the more qualitative and deliberative work, shows that people desire more transparent, more accountable, and more proportionate uses of data. And another part of this background research showed that many people find data topics to be quite complex, and talking about data topics and data use and the technologies that are built upon it requires making sure we can find ways for people to grasp with these topics and understand them in tangible ways. And so for this dialogue, we conducted some research on how to define location data in a way that made sense to people and settled on this definition. Location data is any data or information that can describe the position of an object or person in relation to the Earth or some other object or person. We didn't present this as the final word, the only definition on location data, or indeed the only information anyone needs to know about it, but really as a starting point to get all the participants in the dialogue on the same page in terms of what it was that we were discussing through the dialogue. And I'll hand back to Skye to talk through more about how the dialogue ran and what we found.
Thanks, Aidan. So 85 participants were recruited from across the UK to participate in the main dialogue. We recruited higher numbers of people from minority ethnic backgrounds, and we recruited participants who experienced mental health conditions and those who shielded during the pandemic due to physical health conditions. We also recruited additional participants based on experiences or characteristics that might make people more likely to be impacted by the collection and use of location data. Civil society organizations advised us on how to involve people from these groups. Thus, we added 2 additional sets to the public dialogue: Black British people and those with experience of being digitally excluded. And we designed a parallel track of engagement for women who have experienced abuse, forced migrants, and disabled people. All participants were paid at a rate above living wage for their time. The public dialogue consisted of 4 workshops between June and September, which included a range of presentations by specialists and extra activities through a participant website. The additional focus groups were held before the dialogue to contribute to the design of the wider sessions, and at the end to reflect on the findings. Moving on now to the findings themselves. These spanned 4 key themes: awareness and understanding, data insecurity, accountability, agency and governance, and reliance on and choices about data. Participants often spoke about location data and other forms of data interchangeably, seeing location data as a subset of their data. Throughout the dialogue, they were particularly interested in location data about people due to concerns about being identifiable. Overall, opportunities were framed as being for the wider public, while risks were focused on individual impacts. Participants felt that location data could contribute to systems designed to keep people or society safe and healthy, improve the efficiency of public services, which could save money and improve outcomes, and increase access to services for disadvantaged or vulnerable groups. On the flip side, they were concerned that individuals with access to location data could have power over data subjects, which could present security risks. That location data could be misused or misinterpreted, with impacts on resulting decisions and services. And that profit could be prioritized over the interests and security of data subjects, for example, with data being sold on to untrustworthy companies. The concern about location data use being primarily profit-driven was further reflected in the number of discussions that centered around private versus public sector use, as well as the public sector data controllers being considered as more trustworthy. While participants prioritized use for public good, they did not equate that to mean not making profit. Participants used the language of data security and safety to convey feelings of insecurity and powerlessness over how their data was being used and by whom. They wanted to feel secure in the way that location data was being collected, used, and protected, which drove demands for more personal, granular control over their data, increased transparency, more choices to use services without sharing data, and better data protection. The sense of inequality and powerlessness in the use of data contributed to feelings of insecurity. Participants often noted the power imbalance between data subjects and data controllers, feeling that data controllers have all the power to decide what data they want and how it will be used. And they felt disconnected and only superficially involved in decisions about their data. Their views on accountability, agency, and transparency were closely linked. They valued agency, wanting accessible and transparent information to enable choice at the point of consent and to more easily hold data controllers to account. They felt they should be able to use legal and regulatory routes of accountability, as well as using their powers as consumers. Participants were concerned about the ability of regulators to hold powerful multinational companies to account, with some suggesting more international cooperation. For most participants, consent with genuine choice was important for identifiable data. The ubiquity of technology and dependence on certain services and technologies led to participants feeling unable to opt out of sharing location data and frustrated about barriers to using services that actually don't require location data to function. This added to the perceived power imbalance, leading to feelings of overwhelm and disempowerment. Most participants felt that society was moving towards a future where data collection was unavoidable, and that this has been accelerated by the pandemic. The key findings thus shape a vision for ethical and trustworthy location data use. Intent to benefit society. Participants think that why location data is used and who benefits are important when considering whether its use is ethical and trustworthy, and that societal benefits should be prioritized. Effective accountability. Participants think data collectors should be accountable to regulators and data subjects, with consequences for breaches or misuse, questioning whether current governance is effective in achieving this. Accessible transparency. Participants want data collectors to communicate in an accessible way what location will be used for, who will have access, and how it will be stored, so that they can make informed choices and ensure accountability. They also want the process to enable agency. They want more genuine ways to consent to and participate in data use and ongoing storage. And they suggested that accreditation markers could better enable these choices.
So just to kind of wrap up from the findings, we wanted to touch briefly on what does this dialogue mean? What do the insights that have come out for it mean in terms of policymaking, in terms of innovation, and in terms of further research? So as you can see, there was a lot the dialogue generated, and there's much more in the report besides, but a few things that we think the findings tell us is that there is a real clear sense from this finding in terms of what data for public benefit looks like. And this has been a theme that's touched on by both David and Callum and in the existing research that I mentioned before. But the question of what does public look like, what is public good, what is public value when it comes to data use is a question that will always require a lot more research. And we think the findings from this dialogue are really useful in understanding what public benefit means in the context of location data use specifically. When it comes to building public trust, the findings from this dialogue remind us that really it's not so much about asking the public to be more trusting, but building more trustworthy data practices. And the findings from this dialogue around accountability, transparency, and so on are really useful in terms of figuring out what those trustworthy data practices and indeed policies and governance structures look like. And speaking of transparency and accountability, we're reminded through this dialogue that people aren't just concerned about the data when it comes to what it must be transparent, who must be accountable, and what must ultimately be trusted. They're concerned with the entire socio-technical system that data use is embedded within, the institutions that access and use data, the technologies that are built upon it, the frameworks and governance structures that underpin the whole lot. All must be considered when we're thinking about transparency and accountability, and not just the data sets or the types of data themselves. And the last thing that is really interesting from this dialogue is that views on location data share some similarities with views on data generally, but some key differences too. And I think from, this is a kind of big area to explore more, but some initial thoughts on what those similarities and differences are. The similarities seem to be around the concerns that people hold, don't seem to differ for location data, and then from concerns around data use more generally. It's about privacy. It's about the power of technology companies. It's about who has access to what data and what they're using it for. This seems to be the kinds of concerns that crop up across all kinds of data use. But some of the key differences are around the opportunities, and it's clear from this dialogue that people recognize there are some unique benefits that come from location data specifically. Things like keeping societies safer and people safer within society, Things like making our structures and systems and products more smooth and convenient and economically viable. Things like tackling climate change and net zero. Many benefits come from location data, and the public recognize that, assuming those challenges are balanced. And this question of what does this finding mean for policymakers, for innovators, for regulators, and more is something that we at the Ada Lovelace Institute hope to be able to explore more and expand on more in 2022. So thank you so much for listening, and looking forward to the panel discussion later.
Thanks all. That's it from us.
Thanks both, Sky and Aidan. Let me just remind those who are joining us today, please feel free to use the Q&A to sort of ask any questions that are coming up over the course of any of these presentations, and we'll be really thrilled to try to answer them in our panel. So let me now introduce our keynote speaker, our very own Cosmina Dorobantu, who is a co-founder and co-director of the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute. The program is now home to the world's largest group of researchers working on AI for the public sector and the public good in the world. Cosmina is a member of numerous working groups, including the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England's Artificial Intelligence Public-Private Forum and the Trade and Economy Panel within the Department for International Trade. And she holds a DPhil in economics from the University of Oxford and is a research associate at the University of Oxford's Internet Institute. Hi, Cosmina, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, David, too. Thank you very, very much for the introduction. So we meet today at the Alan Turing Institute, a place of research named in honor of one of the brightest scholars in our field. And in many ways, it is the perfect place for us to launch the findings from a public dialogue on location data ethics. More than 70 years ago, in 1948, Alan Turing introduced the idea of cultural search in a captivating paper titled Intelligent Machinery. The isolated man, Turing wrote, does not develop any intellectual power. It is necessary for him to be immersed in an environment of other men whose techniques he absorbs. He may then perhaps do a little research on his own and make a very few discoveries which are passed on to other men. From this point of view, Turing says, the search for new techniques must be regarded as being carried out by the human community as a whole, rather than by individuals. Well, apart from the focus on men in this paragraph, which I like to think that Turing would revise if he were alive today, this is a beautiful passage. For in it, Turing points out that discovery is a collaborative process. The human community as a whole is what brings color and what breathes life into the intellectual pursuit. So what a joyful occasion today is for the Alan Turing Institute to host this event where we learn collectively from a public dialogue on the ethics of location data use. A huge thank you to the Geospatial Commission and UKRI for commissioning and funding this work, to Traverse and Ada for producing the report, and to our researchers at the Turing who are part of the project's oversight group. Now, we had a great overview in the previous session of the report's main findings. In the short time that we have together, I wanted to bring to your attention two gems within the report that I discovered while reading it. And I love these two parts as they resonate so much with Alan Turing's thinking and with our approach at the Institute. The first is this graph, which so brilliantly illustrates the collective discovery process that takes place when we get together and discuss these important issues. Before the first workshop, only one participant reported knowing a great deal about location data. After the third workshop, 43 participants felt like they knew a great deal about this topic. This is a tremendous increase, which shows the value of engaging the public in conversations around data and the technologies it enables. But this graph tells only one side of the story. It only documents the learning of the workshop participants. But of course, the learning process is greater than that. We all learn from this public dialogue. The workshop facilitators, the writers of the report, its readers, today's audience, to name only a few. And one of the things that we learn, and this is the second gem that I wanted to highlight today, is that when you ask a diverse group of people how their location data should be used, they come up with the most inspiring response. which is that the priority for any location data use must be that it benefits people and society fairly and equitably. I love this message. It's what Turing himself believed in, putting scientific discovery and mathematical insight into making the world a better place. And it is what we are devoting our efforts to at the institute that bears his name. 4 years ago, we set up the public policy program at the Turing. We firmly believe that if the pursuit of the public good is our ultimate aim, the priority must be to identify how AI can help the public sector, the very group of organizations tasked and entrusted with looking after the public good. The Turing is now home to the world's largest research group working on AI for the public sector and the public good. We divide our time between developing technical tools that revolutionize decision-making processes and building the ethical foundations that are crucial to the pursuit of responsible innovation. The public sector is home to some of humanity's most consequential questions, from how to alleviate poverty and minimize the suffering of the most vulnerable, to how to mitigate climate change and build a more resilient future. Location data will be key to addressing some of these questions, and the publication of today's report is an important milestone in our journey towards understanding public attitudes towards location data. In the weeks, months, and years to come, we look forward to continuing with all of you along this journey of collaborative discovery carried out for the benefit of humanity as a whole. Thank you so much for being with us today and for joining us for this important launch.
All right, thank you so much, Kuzmina. We are running a little bit late, so we're just going to launch now into our panel. And let me just begin by introducing our panel participants. Rosalind Goodfellow is Deputy Director for the Geospatial Commission. Previously, she held a number of roles in the UK government, including leading the national implementation of the GDPR across all organizations. Matthew Rice is a Senior Policy Officer at the Information Commissioner's Office, working in the Innovation Hub. The Hub's focus is on working with innovators and companies using personal data in new and novel ways to ensure data protection by design and default are established at the earliest stage. Mick Ridley is Audience Planning Director at Global, the broadcast media firm. He currently leads Global's audience planning offering, working closely with their partners and third-party providers to deliver innovative solutions to support sales, marketing, and partnership operations. And last but certainly not least, Deborah Yates is Program Lead for Data Assurance at ODI. She's responsible for setting the strategic direction of ODI's work to help organizations to assess, build, and demonstrate trustworthiness of data and data practices, leading the delivery of related projects and building partnerships with other organizations. So those were really interesting presentations, in particular, discussions of the data trust deficit and the focus, it seemed, on certain things like public benefit. I wonder, I want to ask the first question to Rosalind about the takeaways. So the public dialogue itself is the first of its kind in the UK, and makes findings, as we heard, including on awareness, data security, accountability, agency, and consent. So what findings or finding really stood out to you, and why, Rosalind? And also, what do you think audience members should really take away from today's presentations and information?
Thanks, David. If I may just start to extend my thanks to everyone who's been involved in this project, including our delivery partners, oversight group members, and of course the public. For me, it was a real privilege to bear witness to the journey they went through during the dialogue, learning, as we heard, from each other, and just hearing the wide diversity of views. And this has, of course, resulted in so many fascinating findings. It's very hard to kind of pick out one or two, but the increased confidence that participants had as they learned that, for example, many use cases require aggregate data rather than the tracking of identified individuals. kind of really resonated with me. However, if there's only one thing that everyone takes away from today, for me, that's we're at the start of a collective journey, not the end. Location data is so important for our everyday lives, but that's not always in the consciousness of the public. Indeed, it doesn't necessarily always need to be, but sometimes it should be. And we need to work together to retain the public's trust, to maximize those benefits. That, of course, involves using and innovating with location data responsibly. But it's also about telling the story to the public about what location data enables for them, such as greener transport and safer streets. And for me, that then kind of goes back to those findings where the participants were so much more comfortable with location data use when they understood how it was being used and for those purposes and benefits that they could feel themselves or for society, as we talked about.
Thanks, Rosalind. Now, you've mentioned, you've made mention about, in a sense, really reaching out to the public. And so in the report, and Cosmina mentioned this too, that initially most of the participants reported that they didn't really know a lot about location data. So I wanted to actually move to Matthew and ask, how can we, in a sense, raise awareness of location data so that the type of thing that Cosmina was talking about, where there is that kind of transformative effect in those who are being kind of developed and upskilled with regard to what location data is, how can we deliver on that for the public, especially from the Information Commissioner's Office perspective?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's a key question as well. I'd also say it's not just a cornerstone of the ethical discussion, but it's actually the cornerstone of the compliance discussion as well. At the very start, and the kind of core principles of data protection require data to be processed in a lawful, fair, and transparent way. And if you're failing to be transparent, then you're failing to be fair. You won't carry the trust of the public, and you'll fall foul of the law. And so that kind of, as much as it is an important thing to consider the ethics, we've also got to remember that this, in its part, that transparency really kind of comes down to a question about compliance too. And one thing that, from a regulator's perspective, we've had to go on a big learning journey about how a person's right to be informed and what transparency actually looks like in various sectors. You know, the kind of most recent aspects have been our work developing in the age-appropriate design code, where we begin to think not just about the population as a kind of monolith, but as discrete sectors and the needs that that particular sector or community may have. And in the context of the age-appropriate design code, this was about how do you explain to children across various different ages what's going on with their data. And that's been a kind of long journey, even for the ICO, to go on to figure out, well, what does that look like from a regulator's point of view? And that learning is seen in the kind of outputs that we're putting out now. And really what we're wanting to see from the sectors and those working with location data is asking those questions. You know, who are we talking to? What are we talking to them about? How are we talking to them? Even questions about when are we talking to them? You know, when we're talking within location data, it's a lot trickier than in browsing, where you somewhat have maybe a bit of a captive audience that's in front of you on a screen. You're in a built environment, you're having somebody move through a space perhaps, and you've got this need to try and communicate to them. So, you know, as much as we're talking about innovation in the kind of service delivery that location data can provide, there's a series of innovative methods that need to be explored about how you actually deliver that information as well, which could be in just-in-time notifications or new models of kind of consent management as well, so where it's not just about telling them what's happening, but also giving a person a chance to give their view about how comfortable they are about what's taking place. But really, I think it's got to be that movement away from just saying we're answering one question here, which is how do we communicate? You're actually answering 5, 10, 15 questions about who are we communicating to and how are we communicating with them? And that's a trickier thing, but ultimately, if we can begin to focus on that, that's the long-term benefit right there.
Great, and I think we should maybe shift perspective and look the opposite way. So thinking now about from the citizens' perspective or from the impacted data subjects' perspective, it seems as if the report really talked about this feeling of a little bit of disempowerment or digital resignation, and had suggested that as part of the findings that we should be moving from data subjects to more involved data citizens. And so, Deborah, thinking about your experience at the Open Data Institute, does the finding resonate with your own kind of research and experience around location data? And thinking from the sort of participants, a citizen, and impacted individuals' point of view, what would a vision for the ethical use of location data look like?
Thanks, David. Yeah, that does resonate quite strongly. Over the years, we've done a number of engagement activities with different consumer groups and members of the public. And the things that come out is actually, when it comes to using and sharing data about them, it's really nuanced. Individuals do think differently. So what Matthew was just saying really struck a chord with me about actually different groups have different needs, and understanding those needs and engaging with those communities to build that trust is the key thing. We did a survey a few years ago which showed that actually in the same way as these findings, people are prepared to make trade-offs and share data about themselves in return for that social benefit, which is great. But actually, when it comes to location data, there is a little bit more of an anxiousness around that, just due to the focusing in of that real individual tracking, that the potential for it at least. Some of the other work that we've done, we've thought a lot over the last couple of years around trust and trustworthiness and what that means. And some of the big findings that we have that link here are that it's really context dependent. It really depends on that community in that geography with those kind of values. And obviously ethics is all linked to that. And so the way that we might demonstrate the trustworthiness, that we are trustworthy to handle that data, to share that data, to use that data, is going to be different. And so engagement in a number of different ways, I think is really important to maximize that value. In terms of a vision for ethical collection and use of geospatial data, so I think about it along maybe the roles of different actors. So it would be great in the future to see commercial organisations that collect geospatial data to be really transparent about how they're collecting it and what they're using it for. I think it would be really great for those that hold the data and the policymakers to kind of create those kind of common standards and frameworks that are agreed. I've been thinking a lot about assurance and how you do that for different groups. And I kind of see that along a bit of a spectrum. And so in some instances, the type of data that you might be collecting, it might be fine just to clearly communicate what you're doing. And in other instances, it might be more appropriate to have a third party come in and certify that organisation or that use is okay. And finally, I think I'd like to see organisations that may be consuming the geospatial data to just embed kind of ethical data practices as part of what they do. Thinking about how that comes into their governance processes, their skills and their knowledge. So it's really part of that overall structure of an organisation, the same way as health and safety.
Great. And so we haven't yet talked to Mick from Global, and I think it might be appropriate for us to sort of shift gears a little bit, Mick, because you're coming with, I think, a unique perspective in the sense that you are coming from the private sector, and in the context of the findings, it was interesting that there was a kind of distinction that was made between public good-oriented uses of data and profit-driven uses of data. So I'm just wondering, from the perspective of industry, how is it that we can sort of have a data innovation ecosystem that properly straddles between the priorities of justified public confidence and trust and the other sets of motivations that the public seems to have a bit of hesitancy about.
Sure. So I think that just to touch on a couple of points before I sort of head into, I think, an interesting case study where I think we can look at best practice. But I think what came through from the report is that sense of disempowerment that the public feel around more commercially focused use cases for location data, that kind of lack of transparency, that fear of who is having my data, where is it going, how is it being used. And I think that trust is critical, and I think we need to make sure that we're working in lockstep with the sort of the commercial kind of stakeholders within this space to ensure that any use of location data which is for societal and public benefit is not eroded through perhaps commercial malpractice. So I think I'd like to make that clear. I think also when we look at location data in the commercial world, often everything is driven by a digital online view of the world, and that online view of the world is very much, I think Matthew touched on it, it's a one-to-one interaction, whereas the physical world tends to involve more one-to-many interactions. And I think we need to think about how that works differently. So for example, you don't need to know about everyone everywhere all the time. You can actually start to think about cohorts, representative sample data that is scaled to the real world, to take away from that individual kind of creepiness that people feel, particularly when they're being advertised in the digital space. Now, in terms of my experience of using location data, just to give a little bit of context for everyone listening. So Global, you probably know Global through their radio brands such as Capital, Heart and LBC, but they're also one of the biggest media owners in the outdoor advertising space. And we work very closely with Transport for London. We hold the advertising contract for the London Underground, which is the largest advertising contract of its kind in the world. Now, that contract is actually deriving revenues, which are then directly passed to TfL to then reinvest into the network. So there's this kind of nice virtuous circle in terms of commercial profit, but public gain on that basis. Now, when we've worked with TfL, we've used location data. Now, we've worked with them very closely on how we can understand how audiences or passengers, customers flow through the network. Now, this can work in two ways. Obviously, commercially, using that data helps us understand when and where an advertiser might want to speak to a cohort or group of people, never an individual. But secondly, it also helps TfL understand their own network. Now, the way that this went about was that TfL worked in lockstep with the ICO, with the GLA, with the Mayor's Office to ensure that all data collection was compliant. They worked with the public, so they had a public dialogue around the collection and use of this data. They have been very clear in their signage on the network about the data was being collected. And again, from our point of view, TfL collect the data, they compliantly process it, so no individual data is actually seen from their point of view either. When everything is passed to us, in terms of our understanding, it's aggregate numbers, and that's it. So all I see is a number of people at a station travel to another station. That is it. And I think that is a really nice way and compliant way of being transparent with the public about how this data is being used. There is a benefit in terms of commercially, there is money being passed back into that network to provide a better service to the individuals using that network. And secondly, it's giving better information to TfL themselves. So they will use this data, for example, during the pandemic, it's been critical for them to understand overcrowding at certain stations. And they've been able to use it to understand at certain points in time on certain areas of the network, it is busy. Why is it busy? Well, it's actually because people are getting on in East London to travel to construction projects in West London. TfL can then go and talk to those organisations to help them stagger start times. So again, it's a nice commercial benefit, but an absolutely brilliant public benefit as well.
Thank you. I'm curious, Rosalind, if you could also sort of weigh in on how the Geospatial Commission itself is thinking through this straddling between public benefit and private interest in this use of location data. How can we? The question would be, how could we steward justified public confidence and trust on both sides of that divide.
So I would say one thing is that I'm not sure there is always a divide, and actually that was something that the participants in the dialogue identified, that public good for them doesn't necessarily mean not for profit. And of course, you know, better transport. I'm a born and bred Londoner. Better transport in London is both a public good, but you know, in some situations, the transport system in London has profit making. You know, but integrating the full transport system to make it more efficient, greener, safer, using location data can have multiple benefits. So I think for me that is something the public can recognize and understand. The key thing, as we talked about earlier, is this transparency point, that they understand, especially where it's their data, where it's data that they think is personal and relates to them, is being used. But for me, I don't think there is I think we need to be careful not to create an artificial divide between what I think the public take or the participants in this dialogue certainly took as a very wide definition of public good, which ranges from improved services for themselves through to environmental and broader social benefits. So that would be my key point.
Great. And I'm curious, Matthew, to come to you. There's been some discussion in the chat and in the report about the differences between the use of aggregated data, aggregated location data, and personally identifiable data. I'm just wondering how the ICO would see sort of making the public aware of the issues surrounding that, and also handling cases where there may be crossover between aggregated data that might become identifiable through data leakage, or other cases where there might be some confusion between.
Yeah, and it's a really, within location data, it's really a tricky question. It's not black and white. Because the volume and velocity that you can get of location data can begin quite anonymous and then become quite identifiable. And so it's really tricky. And you know, we've recently had discussions around this from a reprimand that we issued to a location data broker company called Tamako, who had been collecting data without really being fully transparent, because they were confident that what they were collecting wasn't personal data. And in fact, what they were collecting had quite clear identifiers attached to it, let alone the raw mobility data that was coming through. You know, from an ICO perspective, it's that question of kind of strong, clear communication, that beginning just saying this is anonymous data because it's just data points over a certain period of time isn't really enough. We are keen to understand that over time, you can quite easily understand a data point becomes a routine, and that routine becomes a person, and that becomes identifiable. And that's when GDPR compliance becomes part of it. So in some cases, it would be a smarter move for those who are adopting these projects to act as though data protection law applies, even if they are 95% confident that it doesn't, because compliance isn't, in this instance, it comes in with a lot of ethical points to it, around transparency, around communication, around things like how long should we even hold on to this data. And if you answer that question of not that long, we should delete it after a certain number of days, you're fixing a question that could be, you're fixing a problem that could be a personal data question, and you might not even be collecting personal data as a result. So it's kind of this kind of virtuous cycle that can be established once you begin with the process of kind of thinking through quite carefully about what's really the purpose of our collection here, and what's the appropriate way of doing things. And for the ICO, that's a matter of getting out there, being involved in discussions like this, but also keeping our doors open. You know, we're keen to hear from people who are adopting these projects and want to take steps like Mick was talking about. We want to work in lockstep with new novel processing operations to make sure that we see data protection in there at the very beginning.
Great, thanks. So I think what we'll do is we'll respond to some of our audience questions now. We've gotten a couple of questions, and I think these will likely be for Rosalind because they're directly about the project itself. So a couple of questions about the kind of sampling methods, and first question about potentials for selection biases that could have come through into the findings. And then just another question on sampling Muslims and concerns that this is a particularly surveilled group, and the questions would be, how were decisions made about sampling? I realize some of that is actually in the report, but it would be great if you could maybe address that, Rosalind.
Yeah, for sure. I'll be honest, Traverse did lead on this, and they are kind of a public dialogue organization, so are well versed at doing their best to make sure that we had a broadly reflective group of the UK population. Bearing in mind, it was a relatively small sample of 80 odd people, but we did try to make sure that there was balance across aspects such as location, age, ethnicity. And as I kind of said earlier, from my exposure to it, there was really diverse and interesting conversations because of that. As Traverse mentioned earlier, they also identified 5 particularly impacted groups. Religion itself was not a specific component of that, and Muslims was not particularly brought out, but there was 5 groups, including digitally excluded, those forced to migrate, so refugees and asylum seekers. So we did try and we engaged, or Traverse engaged, with civil society organisations about how best to engage that wide group. The one other thing I'd just add is that we have also kind of followed up trying to test some of the findings with a quantitative survey with a broader sample population, and we're hoping to publish those findings in the new year. We just kind of completed it in the last couple of weeks. So we are doing our best to try and make sure that reduce any bias or any kind of surprising findings to test them through.
Great, Rosalind. And one more question that relates to the commission from the audience, which is, does the commission actually see the Locus Charter and its 10 guiding principles as an ethical framework for the public sector, or what role have those principles played in the framing of the Geospatial Commission's perspective?
Thanks, David. Yeah, so for those who aren't aware, the Locus Charter was with the geospatial industry itself coming together to consider the important issues around location data ethics, and that is something we really fully support, and we're really pleased to see, both in the UK, but actually importantly internationally with the Locus Charter. From my perspective, the Charter provides really helpful international strategic principles. I would say most of those are already embedded within UK data protection laws. So I would very much hope that that UK organisations, including the public sector, are following most, if not all of those principles. It's something we kind of have taken on board in our work, but also want to kind of work with the industry, the public, academics, and a real broad group of people to take to the next step as well.
Thank you. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Just maybe going around our room and maybe leaving the audience with one important takeaway that sort of you're bringing away from this report. And maybe Deborah, you can start. What's one sort of highlight that you're taking away from this?
So I think the highlight for me is actually just reflecting on this discussion and the use of principles and their role in giving trust that organizations are going to be working in a certain way. But the thing for me is the importance of actually moving beyond those principles. So how do we actually embed this in organizations' practice? We are looking into this a little bit at the ODI, and hopefully we are producing things that will hopefully be of help to public, private, third sector when they're thinking about how they might use any types of data, but geospatial data as well, in an ethical way. But yeah, it feels to me like that's the next stage, and how do we all come together to tackle that, to really embed it in what we're doing, in order to build that trust with public.
Mick, how about you? A takeaway?
Again, I think the trust, transparency, and education piece I think is incredibly important. I think when it comes to education, I don't think that's just about educating the public. I think that's about educating all stakeholders within the ecosystem. But also, I think I'd like to add, I think education actually, we're talking about adults predominantly here in terms of the public. I think actually educating into schools is also incredibly important. We're starting to see a lot more sort of work on safeguarding and ensuring children are safe online. I think actually it's important for them to understand, well, actually your data is an important part of you and how you now interact with the world and how you're going to interact with the world increasingly in the future. And I think bringing them along on the journey, because they are the future, is incredibly important.
Great, well said. Matthew, how about you?
So for me, the kind of clear ask for citizens to they want more control, they want more agency, was really clear. But underneath that was they also know what's poor or a surfeit of control or agency. They wanted something that was better than cookie banners, for instance, browsing online. They know now consumers are becoming more sophisticated about what control mechanisms look like, and when they're working for them and when they're perhaps working against them. And so for us, taking that away and saying, we cannot it's not just about the principle of control, it's about the practice, is going to be really clear. And basically my work becomes avoiding cookie banners in location data. So that's something.
And Rosalind, I want to ask maybe a slightly different question to you, which is, so how does the Geospatial Commission now pick this up, the report up, and move forward from it? What does good look like moving from this report into the future?
Thanks. So one thing we committed to back in our strategy of 2020 was guidance in this space. So we are hoping to publish that sort of towards the spring of next year. But for us, it's a continued journey and a continued story. We don't have all the answers. And so it's just really important to continue to have conversations like today, to continue, as we talked about, to engage with the public through all our mechanisms, whether we are a commercial company, a public sector organization, a regulator, that we're all coming and being part of this journey. Because if we don't do that together, then we're going to all lose out, both personally and in professional capacities. So David, that just to say, I mean, the GC, this is not the end for us. This is very much the start, and continue to obviously stay up to date with us through our website and our blogs and everything, but stay engaged with us as well. Thanks, David.
Yes. So I'd like to thank all the panelists and really just highlight that I think from the presentations and from this conversation, the future it looks like a future where responsible data, use of data, location data, has to involve both a more ready and more involved public that has increased agency and increased capacity to understand where and how their data is being used. But then on the other side, besides this increase in agency and an increase of empowerment, it also involves structures of accountability and structures of transparency that can, on the side of public bodies and industry bodies and companies, that can build justified public confidence and assure justified public confidence. And so I think we do need to think of it in terms of those two tracks, both at the individual level and also though at the social and the structural level. So we went a few minutes over, but I would really welcome any of our participants and viewers to now join in the networking sessions where you'll find one of us in any given room. And yeah, thank you so much again to the Geospatial Commission, to Traverse, and to the Ada Lovelace Institute for being involved in the event. And I'll also thank our events team, namely Kate Wicks and all of the others who have contributed on the Turing side. And last but not least, of course, also thank you to our keynote speaker, Cosmina Dorobantu.